For every iconic WrestleMania main event that becomes immortal, there's one disaster that ruins the whole show. In this video, we're breaking down the best and worst Mania main events in history, kicking off with the epic battle between two icons at WrestleMania 17. If you had to pick one match that represents WWE at its absolute peak, this is it. Both men were at the top of their game, the crowd in Houston's Astrodome was electric, and the entire Attitude Era felt like it was building toward this exact moment. The match itself delivered everything you could ask for, but what made it truly memorable was the ending. Austin, the ultimate anti-authority rebel, shook hands with Vince McMahon and turned heel to win the championship. It was shocking, controversial, and completely unforgettable. Some fans hated the decision. Most eventually came to respect it as one of the boldest creative swings in wrestling history. But when it's all said and done, the main event of WrestleMania 17 is still considered one of the best in the show's 40-plus-year history. However, exactly a decade after the brilliance of Rock vs. Austin, Mania 27 gave us one of the worst endings in history. The Miz had been a mid-card heel who somehow found himself as the WWE champion heading into the biggest show of the year. The real problem was that nobody seemed to actually care about this match, including the people booking it. The build was an afterthought because everyone knew the real story was The Rock hosting the show and setting up his eventual match with Cena the following year. Miz was essentially a placeholder. When the match itself ended in a double countout and had to be restarted by The Rock, it felt less like the main event of WrestleMania and more like a random episode of Raw. The crowd barely reacted to the finish because they were just waiting for next year. Miz deserved better, Cena deserved better, and the fans sitting in the Georgia Dome certainly deserved better. As far as WrestleMania main events go, this one was one of the worst. But in stark contrast to this abomination, WrestleMania 30 gave us one of the best endings in the show's history. Few WrestleMania stories have ever connected with an audience the way Daniel Bryan's did. For months, the Authority had been doing everything in their power to keep Bryan out of the main event picture, repeatedly having him outsmarted, screwed over, and then replaced by Batista. The crowd rejected the plan entirely, hijacking shows until the company had no choice but to listen. What we got at WrestleMania 30 was a two-part redemption story. First, Bryan defeated Triple H in the opener to earn his spot in the main event. Then, battered and beaten, later in the same night, he defeated Randy Orton and Batista to win the WWE World Heavyweight Championship. The crowd in the New Orleans Superdome exploded, and the image of Bryan celebrating with both titles while 75,000 people chanted yes is one of the most genuinely emotional moments in wrestling history. This was a rare case where the fans willed a WrestleMania moment into existence through sheer force of passion. However, 4 years after Bryan's fairy tale ending, fans were treated to one of the worst Mania main events of all time. By 2018, Roman Reigns had been positioned as the next face of the company for years despite consistent crowd rejection. WrestleMania 34 was supposed to be the night he finally slayed the beast and claimed his throne, except nobody cared. The match itself was decent, but the crowd in New Orleans was completely checked out. Reigns had faced Lesnar before at multiple other pay-per-views, and the audience had no reason to believe this time would be different. When Lesnar retained the Universal Championship, the reaction was a mixture of confusion and exhaustion rather than excitement. This wasn't a bad match technically, but as a WrestleMania main event, it failed to make the audience care about the outcome. Fans were more interested in playing with beach balls and chanting for Nakamura than watching the Big Dog and the Beast Incarnate battle it out on the grandest stage. However, 6 years after this monstrosity, Roman Reigns had evolved into the Tribal Chief, and we got the Avengers Endgame of pro wrestling. Roman Reigns had been the undisputed top heel since 2020, holding the Universal and later undisputed WWE Championship through one of the greatest long-term reigns in wrestling history. Cody Rhodes had returned to WWE in 2022 to finish his story and had come agonizingly close at WrestleMania 39 before Reigns retained. The rematch at WrestleMania 40 in Philadelphia had the attention of the entire wrestling world, and it delivered big time. The match featured cameos from legends like John Cena, The Rock, and The Undertaker, and was one of the most fun matches in Mania history. When Rhodes finally hit the final crossroads and pinned Reigns to win the undisputed championship, the Lincoln Financial Field erupted. The celebration that followed, with legends like Triple H and Randy Orton appearing to honor the moment, felt enormous. This was WWE firing on all cylinders, a long-term story told with patience and paid off in a satisfying way, exactly what a WrestleMania main event should be. However, not every Mania main event with cameos has a satisfying ending. Sometimes it just ends up being an overbooked mess. WrestleMania 9 is one of the most bizarre evenings in history, and its ending is the reason why. The main event saw Bret Hart defending the WWF Championship against the massive Yokozuna. And despite a solid build centered around Hart as the fighting champion against an unstoppable monster, the match ended controversially when Mr. Fuji threw salt into Bret's eyes, causing him to lose the title. What happened next is where things went from bad to straight-up disaster in the worst way. Hulk Hogan, who had just competed in a tag match earlier in the night, was challenged by Fuji on the spot and won the championship from Yokozuna in under a minute. The crowd popped because it was Hogan, but the decision was immediately seen as a massive overstep. Bret Hart has spoken openly about his frustration with what happened, and rightfully so. It derailed Bret's momentum at the worst possible time and set off a chain reaction that would lead to some of wrestling's darkest years in the mid-90s. But in stark contrast to the Hogan-Hart situation, WrestleMania 31 proved that an interference in the main event can actually make the ending iconic. Heading into Mania 31, Brock Lesnar had destroyed John Cena, ended The Undertaker's streak, and was now positioned as an unstoppable force against a Roman Reigns that the audience still hadn't fully embraced. The match itself was exactly what you'd expect, a violent, stiff brawl between two physical monsters. But then, the music hit. Seth Rollins sprinting down the aisle with his Money in the Bank briefcase remains one of the greatest WrestleMania moments of all time. In a matter of seconds, he cashed in, pinned Reigns, and stole the championship in one of the most chaotic finishes in Mania history. The crowd at Levi Stadium lost their minds. Rollins, who had been positioned as a calculating opportunist for nearly a year, found the perfect moment to strike. What started as a lukewarm main event became iconic because of a 30-second sequence that nobody saw coming. But after witnessing Rollins steal the show at Mania 31, Mania 11 serves as a painful reminder of what happens when WWE chases mainstream attention at the expense of its own talent. The 1995 event from Hartford, Connecticut made the baffling decision to hand its main event slot to NFL linebacker Lawrence Taylor against Bam Bam Bigelow. What made this decision truly insulting was the fact that it bumped the championship match between Diesel and Shawn Michaels from the top spot and treated it like a secondary match on its own show. LT was a football legend, and he actually performed better than expected on the night, but that almost made things worse. The fact that a non-wrestler in a celebrity match was the headline story of your WrestleMania says everything about where Vince's priorities were in 1995. The core audience felt ignored, and they weren't wrong. But if the Mania 11 main event was straight up bad, Mania 16 showed how WWE can have the perfect build and yet end up fumbling at the finish line. WrestleMania 2000 had every ingredient for a classic. The Rock was the hottest babyface in the company. Triple H was at the peak of his heel run as champion. The feud had been building for months, and yet WWE managed to fumble it spectacularly. The main event was a fatal four-way between Triple H, The Rock, Big Show, and Mick Foley, with every McMahon family member assigned as a cornerman for a different competitor. The match was cluttered and overbooked, with the McMahon involvement constantly pulling focus away from the actual wrestling. When Triple H retained the championship after interference from Vince McMahon turning on The Rock, the crowd deflated instantly. For the first time in WrestleMania history, the show ended without a babyface win. The Rock was red hot and ready to be the face of the company, and WWE chose a shock value heel turn moment over giving fans the ending they had been waiting for. Fortunately, 2 years before this mistake, the company had shown exactly what happens when you give a story its proper conclusion. WrestleMania 14 arrived at one of the most turbulent moments in wrestling history. The company was losing the Monday Night Wars to WCW, desperately needed a new top star, and had placed all its chips on Stone Cold Steve Austin, a foul-mouthed, beer-drinking anti-hero who had connected with audiences in a way nobody had seen before. The main event against Shawn Michaels for the championship felt genuinely important because it was. This was the moment the Attitude Era officially began. Michaels was in terrible shape physically, working through a serious back injury that would ultimately keep him out of the ring for 4 years. What he delivered under those circumstances was remarkable. Austin won the championship after Mike Tyson, serving as the special enforcer, counted the pin and aligned with Austin. The crowd in Boston erupted, and the image of Austin standing in the ring as WWF champion, with Tyson raising his hand, changed the history of wrestling forever. It wasn't the greatest match technically, but as a coronation moment and a changing of the guard, WrestleMania 14 delivered exactly what WWE needed at exactly the right time. While HBK wasn't in peak physical condition during this match, almost a decade later, Michaels proved exactly why he's called Mr. WrestleMania. By 2007, John Cena was the undisputed face of the company and the most polarizing performer on the roster. Half the crowd loved him, half wanted someone to finally beat him. Shawn Michaels was the perfect opponent, a legend on the back nine of his career, still capable of extraordinary matches, who was red hot and gave the anti-Cena crowd a hero worth getting behind. The match at Ford Field in Detroit was an instant classic. Michaels threw everything at Cena, and Cena kept surviving in Super Cena fashion. When Cena finally locked in the STF for the submission win, even sections of the crowd that had booed him all night were forced to acknowledge the rise of the new face of WWE. This is the blueprint for how you build a WrestleMania main event around your champion. Take your champion, put him against someone who's a genuine threat, tell a compelling story inside the ring, and let the best man win. The formula was simple, but the execution was what made it awesome. However, in stark contrast to the brilliance of Cena versus Michaels, Mania 32 showed what happens when the audience simply doesn't care about your top guy. WrestleMania 32 broke an attendance record. Over 100,000 fans packed AT&T Stadium in Dallas, which should have created an atmosphere unlike anything WWE had ever experienced. Instead, those 100,000 people spent the main event sitting largely in silence. The match between Roman Reigns and Triple H for the WWE Championship dragged for over 25 minutes without ever generating genuine momentum. Triple H had been positioned as a corporate villain standing in Reigns' way, but the audience didn't want Reigns to overcome him. When Reigns finally won, the reaction was a mixture of flat applause and loud booing from large sections of the stadium. Vince had been forcing this exact moment for 2 years, and the crowd had completely rejected it. The tragedy of WrestleMania 32's main event isn't that it was bad, it's that the making of a perfectly good story was right there. Corporate villain, fighting babyface, big stage. But when the audience has been rejecting your top guy for months and you still don't listen, even the right ingredients can't save the dish. The worst part is the company repeated the same mistake the following year and almost ruined The Undertaker's legacy. If WrestleMania 32's main event was disappointing, Mania 33's ending was heartbreaking for entirely different reasons. The match between Roman Reigns and a visibly diminished Undertaker had no business being the closing image of WrestleMania. The Undertaker was clearly past his physical prime, and the match reflected that, plodding through nearly 30 minutes at a pace that tested everyone's patience. Reigns won clean, which in theory should have been a massive moment. But because the crowd resented Reigns being handed this moment rather than earning it organically, the victory landed with a thud instead of a thunderclap. The Undertaker's post-match farewell, leaving his coat, hat, and gloves in the ring, was genuinely emotional and deserved a better backdrop. But 7 years before this failure, the dead man showed exactly why WrestleMania was his yard. The main event of WrestleMania 26 showed everyone what makes WrestleMania the grandest stage of them all. The rematch between Undertaker and Shawn Michaels had one of the most emotionally devastating stipulations in Mania history. If Michaels lost, his career was over. The build was intense, personal, and the stakes were high as two of Mania's greatest performers collided in the main event of the Showcase of Immortals. The match itself delivered on every promise. Michaels was desperate and reckless, putting everything on the line to end the streak. Taker was dominating and relentless, refusing to go down and protecting his record. When the dead man finally hit the tombstone and put HBK away for good, the silence that briefly fell over the arena said more than any celebration could. Michaels lay in the ring as Undertaker stood over him, and both men knew it was over. It was the perfect farewell for one of the greatest performers in history, and a reminder that when WrestleMania commits fully, there is no stage in sports entertainment that can match it. Shawn Michaels stole the show for almost 2 decades at Mania, and this was his perfect send-off. Until he ruined it for a Saudi paycheck, but we don't talk about that. And if you want to revisit the best versus worst WrestleManias of all time, check out this video next.